Yo, what's up guys, it's the MMA Analyst. I'm going to do a few random videos. Not truly random, I thought about it, but I'm just going to put a lot of stuff out there. I'm probably going to actually end up not making videos real soon. I said I was going to stop, then a lot of people asked me to continue, and so I said I'd do it for big events. But I'm going to do a few little series of videos. Also, I'll still do some big events, and then eventually stop doing videos pretty much altogether. Like, I will come back just because I have to, for like if Anderson Silva fights John Jones or something like that. But first video is going to be called The UFC is All Hype. Now, when I say that, this is something a lot of people already know. It's a lot of people, now you guys think, what do you mean it's all hype? What I'm saying is the UFC is all hype. They make you believe things that aren't to be true are true through hype, through advertising, through telling you something over and over again, through Dana White being loud in your face. So what am I talking about specifically? There's a lot of things that you believe to be true in the UFC that aren't true. You probably think that everybody in the UFC's got a lot of money. It's not true. I mean, the top guys do, but this isn't about fighter pay. It's not about fighters, how they get treated in the UFC. This is about who has the best fighters in the world. Now, right now, the UFC, it's the UFC. There's nobody else really. There's Bellator. There's few ones here or there. But let's remember back when all those Pride cats were yelling, Pride has the best fighters. And all the UFC guys were saying, UFC had the best fighters. And let's look back to WEC when before the UFC owned all these different organizations. Let's look back to everybody thinking about, can WEC fighters hang with UFC fighters? Can Strikeforce fighters hang with UFC fighters? Can, Pride fighters hang with UFC fighters? Let's take a look today at the current state of the UFC and MMA's top 10, according to SureDog, which I think is a pretty good ranking system. And let's take a look at who is on the top right now. Okay, Cain Velasquez, #1 heavyweight. He's a new guy. He wasn't around pretty much 3 years ago. So it's okay. I mean, he did his thing. That's a new cat. So you can't hype up something that didn't exist. There was no hype behind Cain. #2, Junior Dos Santos. Same thing. Came up, fought like 6 fights in Brazil, came over to the UFC, and he did his thing. So those guys weren't around during the the Strikeforce, WEC. Definitely not during the Pride debate. So that's new talent that the UFC has fostered. That's going to happen. Any fighter on the planet who wants to make the most money they possibly can in front of the most people they possibly can will try and get into the UFC. So those are examples of the UFC fostering, finding new talent. They find somebody, they bring them in, that person shows that they have the skill to be a champion, to be a contender, whatever it is. Okay, cool. #3, Fabricio Verdum, Pride, alright? That's a Pride fighter. He came over to the UFC. Not only was he a Pride fighter, but when he came over to the UFC, he got knocked out by this bum who nobody knew who he was, Fabricio Verdum. Junior Dos Santos, who clearly is not a bum. Dana White tried to lowball him on a contract after he signed like a 5-fight contract. Then Dana basically says, now we want to renege on everything. He says no. He leaves. Everybody says Fabricio Verdum wasn't that good anyways. Alright, well now he's back. Now he's ranked #3, Pride fighter. #4, Daniel Cormier, Strikeforce. Alright, so you've got Daniel Cormier, Strikeforce fighter. I'm not going to go through all these cats, but just remember how many of these guys were actually UFC fighters during the time of UFC versus Pride, UFC versus Strikeforce, UFC versus WEC. So far, nobody on the list. Alistair Overeem, Pride, not Strikeforce. Pride and Strikeforce, not UFC. Frank Mir, #7. This is the only guy probably on the whole list, the only guy on the entire top 10 list that was around during the years of who would win. Frank Mir or Krokop. Frank Mir or, Nogueira. Frank Mir, he was the only guy. Now, those other guys have gone through, like, Krokop has, 80 fights. Nogueira has, 50 fights. These guys all fought for Pride, like stomps, all that crazy stuff. Frank Mir, maybe 20 fights. So his body's actually, even though he got through that accident, his body didn't age like these other fighters who been through mad wars. He's a jiu-jitsu guy who tried to do jiu-jitsu. Alright. Anyways, the point is, Frank Mir is the only one on the list. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Pride. Josh Barnett, Pride. Mark Hunt, Pride. Mark Hunt came into the UFC, similar to Anderson Silva, a Pride washout. Now, okay, yeah, we know that Anderson Silva did a little better than Mark Hunt, but we all know that Mark Hunt had, like, no real... He was, like, 1-7, like, just a ridiculously bad... I think he was on a 7-fight losing streak, and then he goes... and he wins his last 4, and he's 1 fight away from a title shot in the UFC. 10 in the heavyweight division. 1 of them was fighting at the same time when the Pride Cats were running and doing their thing. Everybody else in the UFC in the heavyweight division is not ranked on Sherdog's top 10. Alright, let's go down to light heavyweight. Light heavyweight. Number 1, John Jones. New guy. Alright. So, they found new talent, cool. Lyoto Machida, definitely started making his big moves in UFC, but, you know, he had fought a lot of other places. So I say maybe fostered talent. I wouldn't call him Pride. You know, I don't think about it. I would just call him like a wanderer until the UFC brought him together. So it's cool. Fostered talent. Number 3, Dan Henderson. That's Pride. Number 4, Rashad Evans. That's fostered UFC right off the bat. You know, he did his thing. They brought him all the way up. So good job, Rashad. Phil Davis, new talent. These are all new talent, right? Alexander Gustafsson, new talent. Remember, nobody from back in the day. None of them. They're all dead. They're all, you know, Tito Ortiz. Anybody who was back there in that time, none of them fight anymore. But the Pride guys, Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, Pride. Shogun, Pride. Teixeira, everywhere else but the UFC. Ryan Bader, he's not good. That just goes to show how rough the situation is in the UFC. But anyways, alright, so in the top 20, or the top 10, for heavyweight and lightweight, you got like 3 guys who were UFC versus Pride days. You got like 11 guys that were Pride. You got like a bunch of Strikeforce cats. You got random guys, but what about the UFC? I thought they had the best talent in the world. Now you start, if you pay attention, you realize that they acted like it because they're the best businessmen. They're the best business, MMA business in the world. They're the best UFC. They're the UFC. They're the best MMA brand. But they didn't have the best fighters. Today they do because, you know, there's nobody else. You know what I mean? Now, obviously, there will be more fighters to be fostered and come through the... Okay. Let's go down to middleweight. Anderson Silva, Pride. Chris Weidman, new cat, cool. Chael Sonnen, WEC, everywhere else but the UFC. Vitor Belfort, UFC, other place, you know, he did his, UFC. Yushin Okami, he's been in the UFC so long that I can't even really call him anything but UFC, so we're going to say UFC. Michael Bisping, definitely UFC. Mark Munoz through the UFC, Luke Rockhold, Strikeforce, Brian Stan, new, I guess. Constance. This is a horrible division. Look at how horrible this is. Good God. Mark Munoz, Brian Stan, Philippou. Oh, man. Anyways, I'm not going to go for much too longer because I don't know how long this is going to go. My phone, you know what I mean? In the lesser divisions of weight class, you obviously have more because in Pride they didn't have, you know, flyweight division and they didn't have, you know, all of that. Also, it seems like the biggest names from Pride was like Gomi and, you know, different other smaller cats, and those guys are all Japanese and they basically fight in Japan. So they didn't really make the transfer over. But if you look at like heavyweight, light heavyweight, and middleweight, it is what it is. It's right there. Everything was hype. It was all hype. Props to the UFC for being able to trick you into thinking that, you know, Tim Sylvia was the best fighter in the world at the time, or that their heavyweight division wasn't the absolute worst on the planet, or that their light heavyweights weren't, you know, average. But yeah, that's the case. That is the case. That's the reality of the situation. Alright, so my next video, I'm going to release it in maybe a couple days, is going to be called Every Weight Class Has One or Two truly well-rounded fighters, those guys are the champs and the contenders, and everybody else, they're just taking up space. I'm going to find a better way to say that. But yeah, that's going to be the basic topic, because if you look at all the weight classes, that is actually the situation. MMA, it's important. Peace.